My very warmest welcome to Larysa, who chose the film for this evening. By way of an introduction, I'll just give a very brief biography. So, Larysa Bolton is from Kazky consultancy. Kazky means stories in Ukrainian, and stories are at the heart of what Kazky does, whether it be evaluation, research, consultation, or working with collections. Larysa has been a director since August 2022. She was previously the Service Delivery Specialist, Archives and Heritage at Manchester Central Library, and has also worked at University and Business Archives. Most recently, this included cataloguing the Ukrainian Video Archive Society archive at the Yorkshire Film Archive. In a voluntary capacity, she is the curator of the Ala Museum of Folk Art in Manchester. So my warmest welcome to you, and thank you for joining us and for taking part in the festival. So you chose the film for today's screening. We've watched Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, which is from 1964. So this is now heralded as a classic of Ukrainian cinema. Can you talk about why it's important and why you chose this film?
Yeah, so I chose the film because it was the first Ukrainian language film that I ever saw. So I'm third generation Ukrainian. My grandparents came to Manchester as displaced people after the Second World War. That's my maternal grandparents. And I grew up in the Manchester Ukrainian community in the diaspora. And part of that was going to Saturday school every Saturday for 3 or 4 hours to learn Ukrainian and learn about Ukrainian culture. And a lot of the Ukrainian community at that point were Ukrainians from Western Ukraine. My grandparents were from Western Ukraine. And there was a real feeling about trying to make sure that we, as the grandchildren of those immigrants, kept our Ukrainian culture and heritage alive. So in the in the 90s, which is when I first watched this film, it was starting to finally become a little bit cool to be Ukrainian because Ukraine had become independent. The wedding present had recorded their Peel session, so all the cool kids knew what it was to be Ukrainian. They knew about this folk song and this heritage that you had. And I was doing my Ukrainian A-level equivalent at Manchester Ukrainian School. And we had this primer that I've brought along, which is like an introduction to all sorts of different Ukrainian writers from the Victorian period in England, sort of the 19th century onwards. And the first time I heard about Kotyarevsky was when we read Napoleonini, which is an extract from Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. It's the bit about the meadow, when Ivan goes up to the meadow and he's looking after the sheep and all of that. So we read this, and then at some point somebody showed us this video, this is mine, but we would have watched something really similar, and it was Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. And it's the first Ukrainian film I ever saw, as I mentioned, and it was staggering because we were watching something that was in this language that I could actually understand and that people around me spoke, because everything that we got out of Ukraine at that point in the 90s, it was Surgik. It was this half Ukrainian, half Russian language, and it felt really weird. You'd listen to this stuff and you'd think, yeah, but that's not how my grandparents speak. I don't really understand that. So to sit and watch this film, which is visually just like for a teenager to watch, and have something that you're sitting there and you're going, oh, I can understand this, and starting to piece together this literature and this stuff that you're being told by my particular teacher at that time was actually from Hutulshina. She was from Kolomia. To be taught this stuff by people who had lived in that area, and then watch this and start to explore things that were coming out of Ukraine that were made by Ukrainians. I think that's why it's significant for me. It's the start of really getting to a point where I could understand more about Ukrainian culture and be really genuinely interested in it.
The book and the VHS you've got are fantastic, and it's worth saying as well, the copy that we've just watched today is a digital restoration. It's the first time I've seen this particular copy on the big screen today, and the colouring is fantastic, I think.
Yeah, this is the first time since the 90s I've watched it on a big screen, and it was so much better because it would have been like a really bad copy on VHS that we watched. So it was wonderful. I've watched it on the TV obviously, but it was wonderful to watch that restored version. It's amazing, really. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing your book and your VHS in. The film celebrates Ukrainian tradition, language, as you've mentioned, and visual culture. What impact do you think this had on Ukrainian cinema in the 20th century and art in other forms?
I think Parajanov is really interesting in terms of the impacts that he had and this film had outside of Ukraine. Because when you think about the number of people who cite him as an inspiration, you know, it's like Martin Scorsese's favourite film or whatever, I think that's huge. And I think it's kind of interesting in a Ukrainian context that this happened, that he created something like this, because I don't think he was working in a vacuum in the 60s in Ukraine. There's a movement called the Ukrainian 60ers, which includes people like Alla Horska, who our museum is named after, and Parajanov, obviously, people like Vasil Stus. Those were a generation of young people who were trying to react against what they felt was oppression in the Soviet system through creativity and through creative responses, and by trying to explore ideas of a Ukrainian identity in whatever form that would be. So I think it had quite a big impact, really. I think what's interesting as well is Kochubinski, who wrote the original book. His niece Mikhailina, I think she's called Mikhailina, she was one of the 60ers as well. So you've got this connection to the original story in the 60ers, and her obviously having that knowledge of what her uncle had written at that point, and trying to be involved in a movement that was about Ukrainian art for art's sake. So I think it probably had a huge impact, and I think people were very aware of the dangers around creating art that strayed from what was considered to be acceptable, even though those parameters could change very quickly.
And of course there has been a tradition of that in cinema, in Soviet Ukrainian cinema. This leads me on to my next question, actually, which is about the cinematic language itself. So the cinematic language was innovative in 1964 and in stylistic terms still stands out today. For example, the opening scenes, the chaos of traditional life, and I mentioned earlier the scene with the red horses. What is it about the poetic cinema style that was and is so revolutionary?
I think it's really interesting because there's nothing, it's a depiction of rural life, but there isn't anything bucolic about it, is there? There's nothing idyllic, there's nothing, it looks visually beautiful, the scenery, the costumes are incredible, but it's got all that beauty and all that poetry that's speaking to you visually, but it's got the realism of how difficult that rural life actually was. You know, it's a love story, and it is a love story about in a Romeo and Juliet thing, that it's all about thwarted lovers and everything. But there's just, where does love get people in that film? It gets them nowhere. It brings them unhappiness. So, you know, like Ivan's mother is just mourning and in grief because she's lost 5 children and a husband. He goes off to the meadow, and you see that look on his face, and he's sort of the relief of being in an open space and being away from a home full of grief. You know, where does love get any of them? It's really difficult, and that's so Ukrainian, to have the sweet and the sweet and the sour, and the sweet and the bitter next to each other. I think it's so Ukrainian, that sort of like, it's sweet, but on the flip side, you just don't know when the bitter bit is going to come along.
It's almost like an idea from Foucault, isn't it? That it's sweet so it can be bitter.
Yeah.
And those early scenes of those swinging camera shots that really represent, it's not an ideal of Ukrainian rural life, but it is at the same time. It's pure reality. I think it's absolutely brilliant, those opening shots. Okay, talking of folk and tradition, there are themes of folk, tradition and religion in the work that also feature in contemporary Ukrainian film. In a country where religion was suppressed, from the exile of priests in the 1930s to the communist purges, what do you think is the impact of traditional religious form, icons, for example, in the film language?
I think it's really big. I think it's interesting that Parajanov was Armenian, given that Armenia was the first country to adopt Christianity. It's got a very sort of Eastern Christianity in the same way that Ukraine has an Eastern Christianity, because Christianity in Ukraine it doesn't come from Rome. It comes from Constantinople. It comes from that Greek, Turkish, that Eastern Byzantine tradition. So there's that sort of sweep across Christianity, even as far west as Hutushtina. And there's something really it's really domesticated in a way, that whole religious iconography. You have it everywhere. Houses are full of sort of religious iconography. It's really standard, and I can't imagine what that is in an Armenian household, but I'd be surprised if it was very different. And if that is what Parajanov sort of grew up with, there's a beauty to that art. It's gilded, it's specific, it's about people, it's about faces. There's something, in Eastern Europe you've got traditions in Bukovina and North Romania of painted monasteries, all of that kind of thing. There's a huge heritage of painting and visualising and seeing what that heavenly experience is. The Sveta Sofia, the cathedral, is really similar with its mosaics and its frescoes and all of that kind of thing. So it's really visually there. And I think in the UK we don't really see that. I think in the Middle Ages churches were painted, but we've never kept that up. There's something for me in Eastern Europe that it's much more, people hold on to that visual depiction. And it is really, really, it's there all the time in people's cultures. And even like growing up in the diaspora, like everybody's grandma's house was full of religious iconography. So like my grandma above her fireplace had an icon of Virgin Mary, an icon of Jesus, and then pictures of her grandchildren below. And we used to all sort of laugh that we were like next to God in terms of how special we were. But it was there. There's crosses over the doors. And it also feeds into sort of that, how close Ukrainian Christianity has been with paganism and how that hasn't sort of gone away. It's not been, we've sort of lost that knowledge of Christianity coming in and replacing paganism in the UK. I don't think that's happened particularly in Ukraine. There's still quite a lot of that happens. Things are embedded. There's a lot of nature that's woven into a Christian calendar. So I think it's something there in the psyche. So it's really not surprising to see it in the film. It would feel wrong without it.
It's visceral, isn't it?
Yeah, it is visceral, and it's there about when you're living on a knife point in a really difficult rural area like the Carpathian Mountains. It's not surprising that you put your faith in God, and you also put your faith in the magician and folk art and superstition and all that sort of rural mix of everything that comes together.
Thank you. So moving on to the cast, the people who are in the film. So Ivan Mykolaichuk, who is the actor who plays the main character in the film, features in a lot of Ukrainian cinema of this period, and then went on to direct also in Ukrainian cinema. What is the significance of his role, the cast in general, and also the studio who produced the work?
I think it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting that he went on and did more in film in terms of production and direction than just acting. And I think it echoes Ivan, because when you watch Ivan in the film, he does everything, doesn't he? Mm-hmm. He's a man of all trades. He can do a little bit of everything. So there's quite a nice feeling that he took a bit of Ivan with him and sort of became a man of all trades in the film industry. And I think it would have been a very small, difficult community of creatives. So actually you would have had to do a lot of things yourself and work differently and just find different ways to be creative, because you never knew when somebody was going to turn up and say, actually, we don't like that, off you go to the gulag. It's all of that. It's very Ukrainian to be resilient and to find new ways of doing things and to work in that way. And I think it's interesting in terms of the connection that the film now has got to the Dovzhenko, because Parajanov was mentored by Alexander Dovzhenko at the start of his career. now the Dovzhenko, the Ukrainian's National Film Archive, is named for Dovzhenko. And it was a production studio, and it kind of brings together this whole thing that it's a fairly small pool, but actually what they produced was quite phenomenal.
And actually, Alexander Dovzhenko really was one of the people at the emergence of the Ukrainian poetic in cinema. Yeah,
absolutely. So that bringing all of that in and having that as a tradition, and it's just that, you know, the original novel was written by an author who is considered to be a modernist, but actually had quite a lot of not social realism, but that social magic in there as well. So it's such a mix, and I think that's maybe a very Ukrainian trait, that you've got that working through everything.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So, talking of magic, the story is a love story. What significance does this have in Ukraine today?
It's interesting. I mean, it's kind of, as I said before, it's a really tricky love story because it's a Romeo and Juliet love story, and everything goes horribly wrong. It's not, this is not Cinderella, is it? It's a very different kind of thing. And I think it has a relevance today because there are a lot of people currently in the situation that we're in Ukraine with the war, who are experiencing really difficult love stories of their own. And I think it's tragic and it's horrible that is happening. But I think it's a story for all times about this sort of star-crossed lovers. It's Ukraine's own version of that. It's Ukraine's Romeo and Juliet.
There's something very eternal in it.
Yeah, there is, definitely.
Through literature and through film, there's this sort of human nature of love and then loss, and then lovers that could never be. And of course, there are echoes throughout time, throughout history.
Yeah, absolutely. And then trying to find a new way to make your life, even if that's not quite what you would want it to be. And actually, those difficult situations that make people make choices that perhaps in another situation they wouldn't have made. And just how, you know, it's that sweet and bitter thing again, isn't it? It's so difficult. Life is really hard.
I've got two questions about the work that we saw at the beginning of the screening by Ayla Dmyterko. So my first question, On Volya, filling in the Frescoes, is a short film by Ayla Dmyterko from 2023. The film is a postscript to Kiev Frescoes from 1966, also by Parajanov. 12 minutes of remaining rushes were rediscovered in a film canister. On Volya imagines the unearthing of a second canister. So you've seen Kiev Frescoes. Mm-hmm. Can you describe the original work from 1966 and also comment on Dmyterko's response?
Yeah, so the original work from 66 is quite unlike anything else because it manages to be very 60s, very modern, very European, and also very Ukrainian and traditional at the same time. It's a really peculiar mix. And it is that whole, is it Wes Anderson who's the guy who does the close-ups and everything looks like it's in a doll's house. I mean, there's nothing compared to Kiev Frescoes with how that works, and just the little bits and pieces that turn out from the film. And it really does it feels like Kiev Frescoes is the right name for it because they are little snippets of something much larger. So when you watch it, it's a surprise when the scenes change and you get the guy in the bed and all the different things happen, and it makes you wonder what would happen next. So it was interesting to watch the On Volya because that very much felt to me like taking the idea of Kiev Frescoes but actually being inspired by the rest of Parajanov's canon, because you've got the trees at the start, which is very much echoing the start of Teeny when the lumberjack is killed, when his brother is killed at the start, with the tall trees and the boats. And then it felt very much like picking very symbolic things that feel like they symbolise Ukraine and putting them together in that fresco style. So it's very much then what Parajanov went on to try and do with Colour of Pomegranates and all the later films where he's looking at those Caucasus traditions and stories and trying to piece something together and create something that he did, like he did with Shadows. So I thought that was really interesting, and I thought it really it felt there was definitely a diaspora touch to it, because there were little objects like the little boxes in Volya, which are the kinds of things that we've got in the museum, because it's items that have been created by the diaspora, kept by the diaspora, all that different sort of folk art. So it really felt quite special. It did feel like a second part, and it felt like a response. It didn't feel the same, but you could feel Parajanov through all of it. It was quite incredible, really.
Just to touch on the museum, can you talk a bit about the museum, because it's here in Manchester, so we're here in Manchester, so is the museum. So can you talk a bit about it?
Yeah, so it is a little museum, and it's run by the Association of Ukrainian Women in Great Britain, and I'm a member of that, the National Committee. I'm the Vice Chair and the Museum Curator. And we started to collect Ukrainian folk art in the 1950s, and we had various different exhibitions in London in the 50s. Then in the 60s the collection got a little bit bigger, because we were either able to obtain items occasionally from Ukraine, or people from the diaspora and the community were making items, so painting Easter eggs, creating beautiful embroidered shirts and blouses, making pieces of carvings and wooden paintings and things. So the collection got quite big, and it moved to Leicester. It got too big for Leicester, so it moved to Manchester in 1970. And when it was reopened in 1970 in a sort of purpose-built room, it was renamed for Ayla Dmyterko, who was one of the Ukrainian 60ers. She was an artist, and she was murdered by the KGB in 1970. She's one of the artists who, right at the start of the war, had her works destroyed. She was from Crimea originally, and there were lots of her mosaics and murals that have been destroyed and lost completely. It's a bit like Maria Primachenko, but it's different in that her works were installations in buildings, so it's slightly different. So since then we've continued to collect. We have bought material from Ukraine. We could continue to collect items that are made by pieces of art that are made by people in the community. But we're just a volunteer-run museum, so we're not particularly accessible, which is a bit of a shame. But we do open for events in the Ukrainian Club or for Heritage Open Days and things like that, and we're trying to work towards getting an online presence. We've had some photography done of several hundred embroidered pieces, and we're trying to look at a way to get those online and get them shared a bit more widely, because we think it certainly used to be the largest collection of Ukrainian folk art in Western Europe. So it's fairly significant, and each piece has got, it's got the story of a person who made it. For example, we've got a violin that's made completely of matchsticks that was played to accompany Ukrainian folk dance ensembles and at dances and things like that. And we've got costumes, reproduction costumes from various different regions in Ukraine that were made by different members of our community as examples, because nothing was, you couldn't get anything out of Ukraine. You could get things from Canada, you could get things from America, but actually, our women, our members had this whole intangible heritage that they came across to the UK with as teenagers and young women, that they'd had in their villages, and they'd been taught by their parents. And for them to sort of create this material, this is why we celebrate it and why we keep hold of it, because it's a bit more than the sum of its parts, really.
Okay, I'm coming back to the term Volya from Ayla's work. So the word itself, Volya, can mean defiant freedom. Dmyterko describes it as, in quotes, a lexical lacuna that describes the will and desire to exist beyond societal constructs, to be wildly emancipated. That's the end of her quote. It appears in the Ukrainian national anthem and is the subject of academic scholarship. Professor Rory Finnan at the University of Cambridge spoke on this freedom in 2022. The film we saw is a response to the term and the idea that fleeing into the freedom can leave one in solitude. Can you comment on the term itself, the word, what it represents, and also the use of the ideas in Ayla's work?
Yeah, so I think coming at it from a diaspora perspective, Volya is very much the word that that sums up what the diaspora was all about when I was growing up, and certainly the feeling that my grandparents' generation had, because they were very conscious of being in the UK, that the fact that they had Volya, they had freedom, that people who were left behind in Ukraine didn't have, and just how powerful that was, and just the need for Ukraine to get that back. So when 91 happened and Ukraine became an independent nation, it was quite a phenomenal thing. And there was always this sort of, you know, like my granddad never took British citizenship because he was always going to go back. He never did go back, but because actually it's too painful to go back. But it's that sense of like being a free person, and when you don't have any democracy, it's very difficult. And then when you get put into a situation where you do have democracy, but you know those people have got it, it's really, really hard. There's a sort of survivor guilt around it. I think for that generation, they felt guilty. They felt guilty that they had got out. And that's the message that we always had, that it's everything in your life is about, it's about people having choices, it's about freedom, it's about that individuality that you can have, that there are more ways to be than just one way to be. It's about something quite complex, and that for me has been it's kind of fundamental to how I think, where it's about not libertarian or anything like that, but it's just about the fact that, you know, all those choices and all the creative things that you can do with that, and the intellectual stuff that you can do, and the different ways that you can live your life. There's so many things are legitimate, aren't they? It's amazing. So I think that's a huge part of, for me, that's a huge thing, but it's such a driver. And I think that's what's been, for our community here since 2014, and then absolutely more since 2022, it's been that absolute terror of going back to what we thought had gone away, what for 30 years everybody had felt had gone away. Ukraine was another European country. You could very easily book a flight and go on holiday. People going on holiday all the time to Ukraine, going back to see family. We don't have any family there, but we would just go on holiday and stuff like that. It was totally accessible, really great. And all of this has been taken away, and it's heartbreaking. You know, like my mum's 75 and she was sort of, I never thought I would see this in my lifetime again. Why is this happening? It's so hard. So I think it's really difficult. Ukraine has always had a difficult history. It's been part of various different empires. Its identity has been questioned and questionable. So to keep going on through that is hard. But what is incredible is just the resilience of Ukrainians, and the fact that there is still that identity and everybody has it. And, you know, the people who have come over here, who've managed to get out and come over here or come to other places, are continuing with that Ukrainian identity. There are spaces for them to do that. There are lots of children now at Manchester Ukrainian School who are, you know, the Ukrainian school there has swelled because parents want their children to continue to learn Ukrainian, because there's a whole risk of double occupation, because they're learning English now to survive, and where does the Ukrainian go again? So it's exhausting because it's something that keeps going all the time, but there's a resilience there, and that's something that it's quite admirable, really.
Yeah, on this question of identity, so it seems to me the context and the narrative of first the war in 2014 and then the full-scale invasion is, this isn't an invasion because Ukraine doesn't exist. Ukraine is always part of Russia. It doesn't exist. So by extension, Ukrainian culture cannot exist because the country doesn't exist. So from my point of view, it appears that anything that celebrates Ukrainian culture, whether that be film or books, literature, art, is absolutely vital in this context, because it reverses the whole narrative and it reverses the whole context for war. So with that sort of pretext, if you like, what kinds of things can you recommend in terms of resources or places that people can go to find Ukrainian culture in all its forms, film and other forms of Ukrainian culture as well?
Yeah, I think we're really lucky now that there's so much stuff online. I think there are brilliant feeds on places like Instagram for people who are Ukrainians who are talking about Ukrainian culture and language, and talking about, you know, the fact that there was a great post that I saw a little while ago. There's like something like 22 different words for a pan. or a frying pan, depending on which region you're from. And this is, you know, this is what I love about Shadows, that there's loads of words in there that for me are a Ukrainian word, but if I said that in Kiev, they'd be like, what are you talking about? It's sort of these dialect things. So I think dig around on social media, do something to change your algorithms so that you can get Ukrainian culture in your feeds, because I've done that and it's brilliant. I just continuously am following different things. There's TacFlix is a brilliant resource. You can very, very cheaply stream Ukrainian film, and you know, teenies, I think it's about 75p or something like that. It's crazy to watch. That's a really good source. The Ukrainian Institute in London is brilliant. They've got lots of great films and they offer lots of courses and lots of talks. The Ukrainian Institute in Kyiv is excellent too. And there are lots of films there about Ukrainian culture, films, and it's really easy to follow the Ukrainian press in English, like Ukrainian Pravda is online. You know, social media is brilliant in terms of lots of people talking about lots of different things. I've never known so much Ukrainian culture, and sort of either seen things that I knew or think, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. You know, I can't believe I've got to this point and I didn't know this, and I'm supposed to look after this museum of cultural and folk art, and there's still more to know. So I think that's really wonderful, and I think there is still stuff in the diaspora and that's still strong, but I just think it's such a testament to Ukrainians who are still in Ukraine and are still talking about this. So everything that we can do to follow them and sort of like what they do and share what they do is really powerful.
Yeah, and it all does support, doesn't it?
It does support.
It supports financially, it supports the industry, it supports the culture, and all of the beliefs behind it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you again to
You're
Larysa.
welcome.
Yeah, it's been absolutely fantastic. One of my favourite programmes tonight. I absolutely love the film. So
It's
thank
wonderful.
you, and thank you for your insights.
Thank you for asking me out. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
You're very, very welcome.